Hello everyone. I have been on YouTube for a long time and I've never made any videos. This is going to be my first video. I guess I'll start by pronouncing my screen name, Méchant Chaton, which is French for bad kitten. And I think a good place to start is by saying a little bit about who I am. Well, a few things say themselves. I'm a dark-skinned black woman. Probably tell from my accent that I'm American. I'm an American descendant of chattel slavery. And as far as my presentation, well, obviously there's some pretty feminine choices made here. I considered making this video in maybe, a baggy shirt that covers a fair amount and like no makeup, and I considered that because, it's a very common radical feminist perspective that because, femininity is a part of a construct that oppresses women, that makeup is a problem. So I might be better perceived if I wasn't wearing any. The reason that I am is because it would be dishonest for me to not be, because in my day-to-day life, if you were to see me on the street, in most cases when I've made a decision to go somewhere, I look pretty much like this. So, I'm going to start with that. As far as the system we live under is concerned, all women necessarily make some sort of concessions or capitulations. And I'm hardly going to say as a categorical matter that makes them ineligible for being considered feminists, that makes them bad people, that makes them stupid people, or anything like that. It just makes them people doing what they have to do. My personal reasons for wearing makeup is that I feel like it gives me the opportunity to have some control over some aspect over how I'm presented to the world and how I'm perceived by it, because I feel more complete and put together and prepared to handle situations where I'm wearing it. None of those things makes it a feminist act for me to wear makeup. I think that it's two very different discussions when you're talking about the question of whether an action contributes to the cause of women's liberation or not, or whether or not an individual woman might, within the context of her circumstances, depending on her personality and her position in the world, find some sort of personal benefit from participating in these behaviors. And that brings me to the subject of this video, which is one that I'm making because my personal perspective on the sex work industry is that it's exploitative toward women, that it is something that capitalizes on the widespread poverty and lack of options that women have, and that it's something that should be abolished. That's what I feel. And I understand that depending on what a woman's life circumstances are, it might be better than some of the other completely shit options that she has, but I don't think that means that it's something that we as feminists should be fighting for. And there's a lot of reasons. The first is that when privilege comes into the picture, you wind up with a situation where, when we're talking choice, women from different backgrounds have very different selections of choices, and circumstances in which they're making these decisions. I've noticed in the conversation on sex work that, some of the most prominent voices in favor of it are from women who have quite a bit of privilege. And sometimes they acknowledge it in that saying that they have it kind of way. But to be honest with you, it always comes across kind of obnoxious to me. Because, for a woman to say, well, I know I come from, a background that's fairly privileged, and I'm white, and maybe I'm thin, and I'm conventionally attractive. I am actually not being exploited or forced to do this. I could have done anything. I could have, went to a high pricey institution and got a degree. I could have been a scientist, a doctor, a lawyer, a professor. I could have done anything in this world, but what I'd rather do is have sex for money. If I'm being frank with you, I find that impossibly obnoxious, because there's no way, if you've waded into this discussion, that you're unaware that the last I checked, about 90% of women who are in the sex industry would like to leave. Like, when asked if they would like to stay or leave, they would like to leave. So if you're in a position where your reality is not that your choice is between, say, starvation or homelessness and sex work, it's between having, an actual living wage, white collar employment situation or sex work. And you not only chose this thing, which is illegal and people are fighting against, women are fighting against because it's oppressing women, but you're also fighting to expand it from your position of privilege. It seems kind of self-involved. Because, oftentimes when people are making these arguments, they say, well, I didn't pick this because, I come from a history of, abuse or addiction or poverty or whatever. I'm picking this just because I wanted to. But when people go, but what about those people that didn't? Well, okay, now fine, it's time to bring them into the argument. And then they say, well, what about these women who would starve? What about these runaway teenagers? What should they do? Well, as feminists, we're in the movement for the liberation of women. So, yeah, it is our concern, but I think you're presenting a false economy of choice when you're saying that in the event we would like these girls and women to not starve to death, we should be pushing for the expansion of an industry that involves having sex with women who don't want to be had sex with, which is a thing we usually call rape, for money. And we have very different hierarchies going on within society at large and within this industry, and not coincidentally, they look exactly the same. The women who are paid the most out in, straight life are the women who are paid the most in the sex industry. The women who have to work the hardest and do the most back-breaking labor out in the straight world are the women who are working the hardest and doing the most dangerous back-breaking labor within the sex industry. That's pretty across the board. It exactly reproduces all of these same things. It reproduces racism. It reproduces classism. It reproduces homophobia. It reproduces all of these dynamics. So it's not like this is some sort of solution to or escape from any of these problems for any of these women. If you are a woman who is poor, and you're a woman who's a minority, and you're a woman who's disabled, not even the most disingenuous person would argue that there's a reasonable chance that you could be a part of the sort of sex work that involves you not having to do full contact sex work and also tends to often pay more and would lift you out of poverty. Nobody even suggests that that would be an option for you. The women who are making all this money doing these things, they'd be making all this money out in the world. And as far as the argument that, well, out in the straight world, you're still treated like a sex object, I have to say that one gives the impression that you've had an incredible amount of luck, privilege, good fortune, or ability to overlook some things to think that somebody making sexual advances or comments toward you is as damaging as somebody holding you down, strangling you, and raping you. I'm not saying that the former cannot and does not lead to any sort of emotional trauma or damage. I'm not even saying that's not possible for it to be lasting. I'm just saying it's not equivalent. And saying that you can get a scar from a small cut or from a car accident is not implying that the cut from the little nick isn't real, and that you can show someone, you can see the scar, it's there. No one's saying that that isn't a real existing scar, just that people would look at you rather strangely if you were to equate them. And, the industry that has the highest rates of sexual harassment is the restaurant industry. Not coincidentally, that's a very female-dominated industry. It is also an industry that has been unable to unionize because of very powerful and coercive methods applied. Now, I'm going to move on to the conversation of decriminalization or legalization. And I'm going to say the best guess for what the sex industry would look like if it were legalized is the restaurant industry, right? So that means that there would be no unionization. That means that there would be top-down control. That means that in order to meet the standards for operating legally, as far as, zoning and licensure and complying with, guidelines and regulations and testing and things like that, you would have to have such a prohibitive amount of money that operating as an individual would be effectively impossible to do legally, so you're still hanging out in the gray zone. And that means effectively that the overwhelming majority, just like in the places where it's already happened, and we can assume it would be similar here, would wind up in the brothel system. Because me, this individual person here, I don't have enough money to say the porn industry pass tests are $150 every 2 weeks. Ooh, that's expensive, right? So I'm going to assume that, pass tests would probably be necessary, and you'd be kicked out of the pool if you ever come up positive for HIV entirely. So boy, hope I don't catch anything. Also, that's very expensive out of whatever it is that I'm getting paid. For your facility to be legal, it would probably have to be zoned a certain way. And as you can imagine, most neighborhoods would fight against having any of these establishments legally there. So would I be able to just do that out of my house? I don't think my neighbors would be cool with that. So I'm going to say probably not. So maybe I have to move, or probably I'm just going to have to operate illegally. Now, obviously, we have, OSHA concerns, presumably, because it's a real job. So, I'm not sure exactly how I would manage to have facilities meeting the standards for that, because, I can't think of any kind of job that expects you with your bare hands and or your mouth or your skin anywhere to come in contact with anyone else's bodily fluids. That's a pretty serious biohazard kind of situation. But, I guess this is a real job, and except when it isn't, because people want to talk about it as if it's just a job like any other job, but I don't know how you would enforce anything associated with real jobs with this. With real jobs, you are not allowed to discriminate against customers. So I'm not sure how that lines up with any sorts of notions of bodily autonomy or anything like that. The right to consent only matters if you also have the right to non-consent as far as sexual consent is concerned. But how do we go about dealing with people wanting to turn down clients? In the event that someone were to come to me and I were to say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm turning you down, I don't have sex with men, or I would say, I'm sorry, I'm turning you down, I'm not willing to have sex with a guy with one leg. Well, don't we have an Americans with Disabilities Act? I'm discriminating against him. And wouldn't that very likely lead to us setting a legal precedent that a person can be considered entitled to sex? That sounds like that's gonna really suck for women, right? It's kind of hard to imagine that there would be no bleed out across other industries with something like that if we were to establish that, effectively, you don't have a right to discriminate against having sex with people at work. We're making the presumption that if this were legalized, that there wouldn't be sex work components added to jobs that are now considered straight jobs. I don't know why we're making that assumption. I mean, we already have restaurants along the model of Hooters that come very close to having their waitresses also be strippers. I don't know why if we would think that if we were to legalize prostitution that there wouldn't be establishments of different sorts. Probably a good start would be places like massage parlors that would want to add sex work requirements officially on the books to their job duties. Well, that's very unfortunate to people who already work within these industries, right? And of course, escort agencies already operate in a gray zone where, okay, yeah, you can legally pay to, accompany this person, but you can't technically pay for sex because that's prostitution. Well, let's toss that right out of the window, right? So there you go. Can't imagine it making any of that any better for anyone. And if one were to say, okay, well, all of this is just talk about legalization, I want to decriminalize. Well, okay. If one were to decriminalize, I'd love an answer to what we would do about sex trafficking, which, by the way, would explode. Because when you announce, we are no longer going to enforce any laws against this, well, there's absolutely no reason for people to not rush in, right? For our nation to not experience just a huge amount of, sex tourism and sex trafficking and all of these things to meet this crazy expanded demand, right? Because of these lowered, barriers to entry. What are we going to do about that? Because it's decriminalized, so I'm not really sure if we're not enforcing laws about sex work, I'm not really sure what would be done about trafficking. I mean, I guess step one would be determine what is sex trafficking, but if sex trafficking is going to be defined as, using economic coercion to force women to have unwanted sex for the profit of someone else, well, there you go. And, of course, if we were to decriminalize, that would definitely be something more convenient for people who are operating, currently in the gray market and are doing well, and for people who are trafficking them. Both of these parties it'd be more convenient for. I would say that I think that as feminists we can think of a better solution to put our time, money, resources, and effort into for liberating women from the effects of poverty. And I would say it's a false economy of choice. Like, one example that was given in Ceres Revenge's video was, well, what about these, teenagers who run away from, abusive homes and find themselves involved in sex work in order to survive? Well, I can think of a lot of other things that we could do as feminists to support girls who are dealing with abuse at home. One of those things is, well, that sounds like a good place for group homes to step in, for shelters to step in, for more advocacy for more effective domestic violence laws, for lobbying for more funding for child protective services, because contrary to what was said in her video, I know from experience of having been a child who is very terribly abused and turned toward the system, that there exist within that system quite a number of people, predominantly who are women, who care deeply about the welfare of children and who are doing everything that they can. But, between the existing laws, the lack of resources, the fact that individual caseworkers are given far too many clients, that it's far too underfunded, and that in general, compared to the amount of education required to do these jobs, they're vastly underpaid because it's female dominated. These are problems that we could, and in my opinion should be, addressing as feminists, particularly if our concern is the welfare of children. I don't believe that an even somewhat adequate solution to child abuse is, rather than being abused by family members, to be abused by strangers on the streets. And let's be real, if a girl is sucking a dick in a park and she's 15, can she go to a hotel? No, most does require you to have a credit card. Can she rent an apartment? Absolutely not. So she's still literally on the streets, sleeping on the streets, or just at the home of whatever strange, man is like, hey, I'll keep you for a while. That is highly unlikely to be substantially better than the situation that she left. It's just different. It might feel emotionally better in some ways because at least she was able to exercise some sort of agency in attempting to do something about her situation and making some kind of choice. But as far as the material circumstances being better, that's certainly arguable. So didn't appreciate that being put forward as an example because I did go through child abuse and I did go through homelessness as a teenager, and I was sexually assaulted in a situation while I was homeless, and it was not great, and I wouldn't argue that it was better than what I was living with at home. But moving forward and less about me, I also kind of want to talk about some of these, what I personally feel are disingenuous comparisons. One comparison that Ceres Revenge made a lot is, well, just very broad ones. Like she said, wearing makeup is sex work. All women who interact with men sexually are doing sex work. And some of the biggest sex workers that we have in the world are women like Hillary Clinton and Melania Trump. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and start with that example and move on from there. As far as Hillary Clinton and Melania Trump, now, we don't know a lot about Hillary Clinton's home life, and we technically don't know about Melania's, but because Trump's first wife, Ivana, wrote a book about her experience with him, we can extrapolate and presume they're dealing with similar things. Now, what sort of things did Ivana say she was dealing with? She dealt with being beat up. She dealt with being physically dragged down the stairs by her hair. She dealt with being kicked. She dealt with being held down and being raped. These are the kinds of things she dealt with. Now, we'll just move on to Melania Trump. We can assume she's dealing with some amount of these things, or at least has, because she's dealing with the same person who's given me no reason to imagine his temperament has changed. And we also know very much so that she's dealing with infidelity and any of the risks that come with that, like STDs and things like that. And we also know that she herself came out of sex work. We know that, there was some nude modeling involved, and from what I've read, the modeling agency she was associated with, has been known to be associated with prostitution, to essentially be part of a prostitution ring. And several of Donald Trump's modeling agencies, in fact, have been involved in prostitution investigations. So we can assume that she is that she was a woman who's trafficked and prostituted, and then went on to be with an abusive man. As far as Hillary Clinton is concerned, we know that she has also dealt with infidelity. We've heard no rumor or suggestion that she's dealt with verbal or physical abuse. And we've also heard no rumor or suggestion that she's been forced to have sex by him. I mean, there have been women who have made claims like that about him, so it's possible, but we've at least heard nothing to strongly suggest that that's a part of her reality. I would argue these women have vastly different experiences dealing with these men as far as how much damage has been done to them, how much danger they're in a day-to-day kind of basis. I think it's a false equivalence. If we move it forward to just the general population of women who are dealing with men sexually, which, first of all, is almost 90% of women, and, at some time or another. But anyway, if we're going to make the argument that everyone is a sex worker, then that means nobody is, right? And if right now I'm doing webcam sex work because I'm wearing makeup, well, what I'm doing is perfectly legal, so I can't imagine what you're fighting for. Legalization. It's legal to marry, legal for me to wear this makeup. You said it's all the same thing, so what is it that you're fighting for? Like, it's disingenuous. You don't really believe these things are all equivalent. In fact, I'd argue it's disingenuous to even use the term sex work as this blanket term, because it refers to a very wide range of different things that have a very wide range of dangers associated with them, of traumas associated with them, of risks associated with them, and of personal contact with people associated with them. Like, if we were to have, I guess, like a scale of some kind, I would definitely argue that some of these activities fall in different places than others. Like, when you're talking about anything that you're doing remotely, like whether it's telephones or it's cam work, these are situations where you're not facing the risk of physical violence from Johns, because they can't touch you, right? They don't know where you are. Like, I mean, it's possible for them to stalk you, but it's possible for anyone to be stalked, but presuming that they don't, hack or stalk or something like that, the day-to-day business of your work doesn't involve them getting within arm's reach of you. And within arm's reach is a very big deal, considering what they do with their arms. It can be slapping, hitting, punching, strangling, murdering, right? And prostitutes deal with 20 times the rate of murder than women who are in the straight world. That is astronomical. And it's completely disingenuous to say, well, it's not that dangerous and people are overblowing it and all women are dealing with da-da-da-da-da-da-da, when you're talking about something where they can't get you, they can't get to you. Talking about something very different when you're talking about prostitution. And I would argue that it's probably fair enough to not use the term prostituted woman for, I guess we could say, sexual entertainers who are not doing full contact sex work. I think it makes far more sense to use the word prostitute exclusively when referring to women who are having sex with people for money. And teasing someone in a video is not having sex with them. Dancing around on a stage is not having sex with them, right? Yeah, it might get them sexually entertained or aroused or something. It's not having sex with them. Now we want to get to the subject of full contact sex workers, i.e. prostitutes, that's a very different thing, and they're out here getting murdered, right, in pretty high numbers. And as far as how much control over the situation, it's far easier to, exact varying amounts of control when you have the ability to completely cut off the interaction at any point at no immediate physical consequence. It's a very different situation where you can't, right? Sure, I imagine it might be very, it might feel very powerful and emotionally gratifying to be able to definitely set the terms for interaction with a man of what he can do, what he can't do, what will happen, what won't happen, be able to, negotiate that and establish that and have that be stuck with. But in real person-to-person interactions, that's something that even women who are completely uninvolved with the sex industry struggle with all of the time. Like, again, just having a boyfriend, a husband, a blind date, or some other guy on the bus, it's hard as a woman to be able to feel that you can establish and maintain your boundaries for what behavior you'll accept from this person without facing dire physical consequences for attempting to do this, right? And what exists within the world of prostitution for maintaining this boundary primarily is pimps, right? They make sure the women get paid. They make sure that, what happens is what was on the menu and what was established, that whatever timeline was established, when the time's up, they get the fuck out. That's what they do. And as far as operating in prostitution without one, even you, Ceres Revenge, in your video, have spoken about how that's difficult, right? As far as maintaining safety and having someone check in and things like that. If the only way to do that without having the person effectively be a pimp is them doing so without pay as a favor, that's something that's difficult to impossible to expect on a consistent, regular basis. Well, that's why people wind up having pimps, right? It's not that, all of these women, individually, randomly, for some unexplained reason, decide they just really like to share their money with somebody else. They don't. They just really need that sort of assistance and enforcement. Because, generally speaking, men hate having to be limited by the boundaries of women, and that goes double with sex work, because, they barely, if at all, think that they should have to respect the boundaries of their wives, girlfriends, or co-workers. Of fucking course they don't feel like they should have to respect the boundaries of hookers. That's a thing that's not confusing or surprising to us as far as male behavior in the view of women is concerned. So it's a completely utopian, unrealistic, unrealizable vision that it can be all women out here just deciding what they will do and what they won't do and what they'll be paid for it, and men will just respect that and they won't try to push these things, and whatever sum they ask for, they'll pay, and if they're not willing to pay it, they'll just say, well, thank you for your time, I enjoyed this negotiation, now I'm going to leave. And if they can't find any woman anywhere that will agree to whatever thing it is that they want to do, well, they'll just sit on their hands and think. No, what's real is maybe they'll come to one woman, right, and they'll say, I want XYZ, and she'll say, well, I'm willing to do ABC, and that's all you're going to get. And maybe they'll say, well, I'm still, into her or whatever, and, fine, I'll buy into this interaction. And then they'll go and find another woman, usually a woman lower down the privilege scale, who's therefore more desperate, and they'll say, I want XYZ, and she'll say, okay. And then hopefully he'll pay her what's agreed for that. Maybe he'll pay her half, or maybe because she's lower down the privilege scale, therefore he thinks even less of her, he'll just do it anyway and go on about his business. That's how that goes. And essentially, kicking it down the privilege ladder, dealing with this shit, is what prostitution has done forever, right? Higher in the hierarchy are, the women who can be choosier and who are considered, more valuable. And then lower down the ladder are the women who could do stuff that they don't want to. Excuse the interruption there, but back to it. So yeah, women further down the ladder get to do what they don't want to do. And in my opinion, it is not going to be the case that we're liberating all women until we're considering solutions to include all women. And, I think that it is a matter of getting too self-centered with your concerns when you're willing to put forth a solution that you're aware would be harmful for people, women, that are less privileged than you and suffer in ways that you don't, because for you it would either not be a problem or it would be an improvement. Like, there always has to be this balance and this consideration, or there should be, moving forward so that we can liberate everyone. And as long as we accept the notion it's okay for there to be an underclass of women that can be exploited, as long as the women who are not in that category don't have to deal with that sort of treatment, then I think we're moving further from and not getting closer to a solution to these problems. The problem is female poverty. The problem is a lack of ways of incorporating being a woman and also being a mother into the current, capitalist system and the job market. The problem is women lacking resources, and it's not a solution that we have an escape valve of women who get to deal with the worst of male malfeasance for a fee, whereas we have other women who are able to make other sorts of choices. Like, that's not any kind of solution that appeals to me. I think that the sorts of things that we should be focusing on is making sure that women have the ability to leave if they would like to leave and have other options, therefore a reason to do so. And as far as the question of why so many get caught up with these Jesus freaks, well, so many of these women have not had anyone that either treated them like they didn't exist, like trash, or like a whore in years, right? Like, Shelley Levin, Pink Cross, there's obviously it has its problems. All of the things associated with that have their problems. But one thing that really kind of had an effective emotional appeal for me was when she was talking about, one thing she did was sent little Christmas presents and cards to porn stars. And so many of the women, received them and decided that they wanted to be involved with the organization and exit, pornography and things like that, because it's the first one that they've received in years. It's the only one they received that year, because once they became involved with sex work, they were ostracized from their families. In most cases, it was only partially because of the sex work and partially because of, the drugs and the exacerbation of mental issues and things like that that comes with it, right? Because it's causing all this trauma and damage. And although the image that we often have presented to us by the media of women who have, dealt with traumas is that they're very delicate and they cry and they're very fragile, the reality is that a lot of women who have dealt with traumas are angry, they're irritable, they're easily frustrated, and often they self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, and often, some of the behaviors that they have towards people around them can be harmful. And, as they say, hurt people hurt people. I've had family members who've, wound up in prostitution and hooked on drugs, other family members, for example, didn't want them coming around the house. Not because they had so much judgment for how they were making a living, but because since they were hooked on drugs, when they came in the house, they might steal things, or if you let them stay with you, you might have Johns coming out of the house. They might, harm other people that are in the house. People looking for them might break in and, steal things or hurt them or hurt you or things like that. Those are realities that are associated with that. And it's not the case that, the women who are caught in these isolating cycles just find it so empowering to sell their bodies so they can get more money for drugs. They're just trapped in their addictions, and there's no obvious way out because there isn't enough social support for them to get out, and there isn't an out. There isn't some alternate thing for them. Well, I think our responsibility as feminists is making sure that the only people that are showing them that we see how they're suffering and we know how hard it is to deal with what they're dealing with physically and emotionally, and we understand that these things take a toll, and we care about them, and we care about them enough to have some actual tangible something to provide them as far as a means to get out. Even basic things like, a place to stay that isn't your pimp's house. Basic things like, some sort of, job skills or job training or education so that you can have some kind of a job that pays a living wage, some sort of treatment for addiction, some sort of, methodology for dealing with whatever, mental or emotional issues they might have, either that led them to wind up in it because it was difficult to hold down a straight job, or that appeared once they were in it, or were exacerbated or created by drug addictions, or all of these things. There's a lot of factors that come into it. And, it really shouldn't be the case that the only people that are saying, I want to offer you a bed and a hug, is people who are trying to drag you into their cult. There's absolutely no reason why radical feminists shouldn't be, doing the work of supporting exit women, because like I said earlier, 90% of women in prostitution want out. That doesn't mean the 10% doesn't exist. And like I said earlier, we're talking about a separate category when we're talking about people who provide adult entertainment. But when we're talking prostitution, that's hard, deadly work. That is not something that any substantial number of women would or do choose when they have any other kind of realistic options for themselves. As far as the category of adult entertainment, camming, stripping, other sorts of non-full contact sex work, I think that there's certainly discussions to be had about improving the conditions within these situations, conversations to be had about whether these things should exist or not. I personally don't think that it should, that anything connected to sex should be existing in a paid form, because I think that introducing money to the equation is introducing coercion, and introducing coercion is something that makes consent a less valid concept. That's not my belief, but I have encountered other people making different arguments for that at least have some matter of persuasive power, and certainly have some validity and can have some applicability to their situations. But I don't think it helps matters in any way, shape, or form to lump it all together. And I think that it's just straight up sexist garbage. It just sounds like rape culture, patriarchy talk to try to claim that it's empowering to women. I fundamentally disagree with that. But that's basically my feelings on the subject and my responses to some of these things. So you know, leave your comments if you have comments. Thank you for your time. Bye.